Hey guys, welcome to the next installment here in our American history lessons, and today we're going to take a look at the first lesson, or the first part of our period 7 unit, which is covering American imperialism. And if you remember back to world history, when you learn about imperialism on the world scale, you got to remember, keep in mind that imperialism is when a stronger nation dominates a weaker one in terms of political, social, and economic means. So when we're talking about American imperialism, we're going to see it's a little bit different than that of like the British and the French, but the principle still remains the same. And before we move into kind of the stages of imperialism, I want to just take a look at this political cartoon here, because I think it does a really good job of kind of showing the stages that America has gone throughout our study this year, from the beginnings in the 1780s, right after the end of the American Revolution, all the way up until now where we are, which is the end of the 1800s and the beginnings of the 1900s of the 20th century. So if we take a look real quick here at the different levels of what America has become, we can see here that it just kind of in its toddler stage. It's a 13-state union. President George Washington eventually, once the Constitution is ratified in 1789, and now we're finally being established, but by no means are on the same trails or on the same levels of that of the major European powers like a Spain, France, or England. But then we kind of move through into the younger years. We're now prior to the War of 1812. We've now up to 17 states that Louisiana Purchase has doubled the size of the country, so they're growing a little bit, but still a young child, definitely not an adolescent yet. Then we get to become a teenager here in this 1819s, prior to the Civil War era. We now have 22 states. With the Adam-Onis Treaty, now have picked up Florida from Spain, and we're developing. They're really kind of establishing themselves, but still nowhere near where that of England or France. We then kind of transition into the young adult years, okay, and right around the Civil War times, where they are an established nation, trading partners with England and France, especially other European powers, but by no means a global power, by no means has the same capacity of the other major European countries, but definitely no weakling as far as on a global scale. And then we kind of shift now into where we're at during this age of slightly past the Gilded, and now into this new, almost 20th century progressive / imperialist era, where now we're becoming old men and fat cats. And America is growing. America has, during the Gilded Age, become the largest industrial power, and now they're also becoming one of the larger landmass powers, or really kind of just strong nations in the world, a top 10 type of country, competing with the likes of the major countries on a global scale. So I like this map because it does a really good job of kind of showing how from the 1890s to the early 1914s that the United States is expanding into the Pacific Ocean. So instead of expanding south into Central and South America, or east into Europe and Africa, they're expanding west into the Pacific and into parts of Asia. We expand eventually into Hawaii and Midway, and then eventually we'll talk about the Spanish America, where we pick up the pieces of the Philippines and Guam and the Samoa, and also Alaska. Seward's Folly is what brings us Alaska right after the Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward. So the United States is expanding westward, kind of achieving, now that Manifest Destiny has been achieved, achieving Manifest Destiny on more of a global scale, pushing farther and farther westward. So keep in mind, with the different stages that we're talking about with American history and American expansionism, the U.S. at this point, right after the end of the American Revolution, looked like this. And you have your 13 states here, and your Mississippi River is the boundary. And then George Washington is going to promote things like neutrality. Right? We talk about warning against alliances and staying out of European nations' affairs. We know that does not always hold true, but a lot of the 1800s is governed this way. And then we get to the era of good feelings, the 1819, 1820s, and after we gain Florida, we gain some territories out in the Midwest from the Louisiana Purchase. We've now more than doubled the size. We are no longer an infant. We're no longer a toddler. We're now kind of a young adult. We are into our teenage years, and President James Monroe puffs out the chest of the American nation a little bit by his Monroe Doctrine, saying that the U.S. is closing off the West Hemisphere to European powers, that any independent nation on the Western Hemisphere will remain independent and will not be threatened by that from the European countries. And then obviously we know that with Manifest Destiny and President James Polk, that now into our young adult years as well, and kind of becoming a young man, the United States is expanding through different annexations, whether it be Texas or California, going into the Mexican-American War, creating the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, or that Gadsden Purchase, kind of expanding and achieving, fulfilling the Manifest Destiny, and now controlling the entirety of the continental United States. But now we're an old fat man, and the United States, now that Manifest Destiny is achieved, is now looking to expand into places outside of what we would consider normal borders of the U.S. And that includes, again, Alaska's, Hawaii's of the world, the Guams, and Puerto Rico's. And this is kind of where it's going to go. But we can, again, see the progress going from the early toddler or infant years all the way to the old man years. And we can see kind of in this chunk of time, we're very neutral when it comes to the European powers. However, this is not going to be the case now that we're getting into imperialism, because a lot of American politicians and a lot of the Americans are going to want to compete. They're going to want to gain territories, as so are the Europeans, to kind of balance of power. We don't want to fall too far behind. And we should remember that from 9th grade in world history, when we talk about one of the causes of World War I being nationalism and imperialism, that people are trying to compete and they don't want to fall behind in the game that is known as imperialism. So when we're talking about imperialism, we got to focus on the motivations of imperialism. We got to try to think about what is happening during the Gilded Age, and one of the major reasons is going to be industry. The idea that we need new sources and raw materials and overseas markets for the major industries of the world. So the major companies that were kind of established during that Gilded Age, whether it be Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil, they're looking for new places to sell. They basically tapped out their markets here. They've established their near monopolies, and they want to continue to advance, and they want to continue to thrive across the globe. Americans are also motivated by the idea of expansion. And now the fact that the West has basically been closed off, and that really the entirety of the continental United States has been established, there's nowhere new to settle to. Therefore, we want to expand out to places that are not necessarily in the continental United States, like a Cuba, like a Puerto Rico, or a Guam. And again, they want to feel like they're competing. They don't want to fall too far behind the major European countries of Great Britain or France or Belgium or Germany. And you can see here in this map, it kind of shows where the European powers are colonizing. Again, for the most part, South America is off limits, but Africa and Asia especially are going to be chewed up by the major European powers, and the United States does not want to fall behind in that area. They're also going to be encouraged by this man, Admiral Alfred Mahan, who encourages the U.S. to build a modern navy. He believes that it's what's called the Great White Fleet. That the Americans, or any country in particular, is going to be as powerful as their navy is, and you need to establish colonies across the world to establish naval bases, and that will allow you to be powerful and compete on a global scale with the other countries of the world. There is a segment as well that believes in the idea of social Darwinism, and we talk about this in world history as well. This idea of civilizing inferior races. And this little cartoon here shows President McKinley, who was more of the imperialism president, going into a place like the Philippines, and trying to bathe or trying to cleanse with civilization the people of the Philippines. And you can see here that the child is resisting, while you have some here in the background that are putting on United States clothing, kind of showing that they are adhering to it, that they are following that. So this is kind of a place where we're spreading technology, spreading civilization, spreading democracy, spreading Christianity. This can fall into good or bad reasons. This can have racist tinges to it, like the social Darwinism theory that certain races are better than others. But there are also humanitarian things that go with this, missionaries and so forth, that are doing for good, for spreading hospitals, spreading schools, spreading Christianity, or just basic religions as well. And this idea of social Darwinism can also be contribute to White Man's Burden, which we hopefully should remember the poem White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, where basically talking about it is the burden of the white Europeans to go into places like Africa and Asia and fix the non-white people who are backwards and uncivilized. So this is where you see the racist twinged part of the socialist establishments as well. But like we said, it can kind of go back and forth, where you do have humanitarian aid, like the establishment of churches and hospitals as well. So let's talk about how America is going to annex and imperialize parts of Hawaii, or the island of Hawaii. And the idea of Hawaii starts around really up to 1820, but more so after the Civil Wars, where it's really going to pick up. And a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but Americans are moving out to missionaries, or out to Hawaii as missionaries, and also fruit plantation owners, because there's huge banana plantations and sugar plantations out there. So they see a way to make profit off of that, and they're moving out for economic reasons. In 1891, though, Queen Lily, who comes to power, she really wants to try to force the Americans out of Hawaii, reduce their power, and kind of establish more of a native Hawaiian, or a Hawaiian nationalist island. However, some of the Americans that are staying there are going to work together to overthrow, and kind of like in a coup d'état example, and remove her from power in 1893. And once that takes place, Hawaii is void of government, and the Republic of Hawaii is going to be annexed by the United States in 1898 as a new territory. Once we start getting into now the 1890s, China is starting to be opened up as well, and mostly by Europeans, but the Americans are going to want to break into this as well. We talked about briefly in your timelines that you guys did for period 5 that that Commodore Matthew Perry is going to try to expand into trading with Japan. And now we're talking more about China, and the spheres of influence is talking about the exclusive trade routes in China. And you can see here by the map where it kind of shows where different European powers had trade rights to China. Again, China wanting to be as isolated as possible is going to be kind of forced into this trade by the British more than anything, with the Opium War, or the Opium Crisis, that starts to take place in China. And going into 1899, then the United States is going to declare an open door policy. And make sure we know that word, open door policy, in China, to allow free trade by any nation in any port, is really going to kind of break off this sphere of influence where only certain countries can trade in certain areas. So this is more of a free trade policy. Again, remember the word being open door. All right, so let's go ahead and let's move into now Cuba. And the story of Cuba is really kind of twofold. And prior to 1895, Cuba was a Spanish territory. In 1895, they're going to declare their independence from Spain. They're going to try to revolt against the Spanish, and the Spanish is going to use brutal tactics like quarantining and basically starvation by not sending supplies, by trying to cut them off from trade. And because obviously with Cuba being an island, they are fixated on having to trade in order to get everything that they need. And you can see the horrible pictures here of the young boy starving. This was commonplace at this point. The United States is going to sensationalize, and another good key term to know here, yellow journalism. All right, and I want you to kind of think of yellow journalism as what we think of in today's media as fake news, where there might be some truth in it, and not everything is fake news, but it's definitely exaggerated. And that's what we mean by the word sensationalized. And this is going to be commonplace because a lot of people within the United States, they want to expand. They want to expand into Cuba as well. They want to fulfill manifest destiny now outward, outside of the continental United States. And in 1898, the U.S. is going to send the USS Maine to Cuba to protect American interests. Because again, just like in Hawaii, there are American plantation owners who are working there in sugar plantations and so forth to make profit and sell back to the United States. And in 1898, the ship mysteriously explodes. Well, using yellow journalism, or what we would consider fake news, the media will go haywire with promoting the idea that the Spanish blew up the ship. And this is going to cause the Americans to declare war on the Spain. Now, looking back now, we know that this was not the case, that more than likely a barrel of gunpowder or something went off that caused the destruction of the ship, but it was not the Spanish. So this yellow journalism is going to contribute to the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. And you can see here in the example of the newspaper here, destruction of the warship, the Maine was sunk by the work of an enemy. And it's going to cause the United States to declare war on the Spanish.